Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight's story comes from an email I received from a listener named Adam. He described an experience that happened to him on a cold December night a few years ago, involving an old train station, a blizzard, and something he could never quite explain. Let's dive in. Read, the first flakes of snow had started falling as I stepped out of the grocery store. My arms were full of last-minute Christmas gifts and supplies ribbons, wrapping paper, a bottle of red wine for the family dinner. I glanced at my watch and quickened my pace, knowing I'd be cutting it close if I wanted to catch the last train home. The streets were eerily quiet for a Christmas Eve. The shops were closed, their colorful lights twinkling in the encroaching darkness. My breath puffed in front of me as I hurried toward the small, nearly forgotten train station on the edge of town. It was an old place, the kind you'd expect to see in sepia-toned photographs, with a single platform, a weathered ticket booth, and a flickering overhead lamp. By the time I arrived, the snow had turned into a full-blown storm, the wind howling through the barren trees like a mournful ghost. I checked the schedule pinned to the station wall and saw the last train was still listed to depart at 10:15 p.m. I glanced at my phone. 10:05. Just enough time. But as I sat down on one of the cold wooden benches to wait, I noticed something strange. The station was completely empty. No commuters, no staff, just me and the muffled sound of the storm outside. At 10:13, a loud horn echoed through the air, cutting through the wind's wail. I looked up and saw the faint glow of a headlight in the distance, growing brighter as the train approached. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks grew louder, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief. The train pulled into the station with a low groan, its brakes hissing as it came to a stop. But something about it didn't seem right. The cars were old, much older than I'd expected. Their metal surfaces were tarnished, their windows clouded with grime. The paint was faded, the letters on the side barely legible. I squinted to read them. Midland Line. I didn't recognize the name. The doors slid open with a mechanical wheeze, and a gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, musty smell. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the empty station behind me before stepping aboard. Inside, the train was dimly lit, its flickering overhead lights casting long, unsteady shadows. The seats were worn and threadbare, their fabric faded to a dull gray. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and carried the faint scent of mildew and something else. I couldn't place a something metallic, like rust or old blood. I moved down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, and chose a seat near the back of the car. As I sat down, I realized I was still alone. The train lurched forward with a sudden jolt, throwing me back against the seat. I stared out the window, watching the snow-covered landscape blur into darkness as we picked up speed. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal, a little unnerving. The faint hum of the engine, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks, the occasional groan of the train as it navigated a curve. But then I noticed something strange. The windows were fogged up from the cold, but I could just make out faint shapes moving outside, figures walking along the tracks, their forms hazy and indistinct. At first, I thought they were just a trick of the light or my imagination. But as the train continued, they became more distinct. There were people out there. They walked in slow, shuffling steps, their heads bowed against the wind. Their clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a history book. Long coats, wide-brimmed hats, heavy boots. And their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow. I pressed my hand against the window, trying to get a closer look, but the glass was ice cold, and the figures seemed to vanish into the snow as quickly as they appeared. I pulled back, my breath fogging the glass, and felt a chill creep up my spine. A sudden noise broke the silence, a sharp thud, like something heavy hitting the roof of the train. I froze, my heart pounding, and looked up at the ceiling. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound that sent shivers through me. It moved along the length of the car, slow and deliberate, before stopping directly above me. I held my breath, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the soft creak of the train and the howl of the wind outside. And then, out of nowhere, the lights in the car flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. For a moment, I sat frozen in the dark, gripping the edge of my seat as my ears strained against the oppressive silence. The scraping sound on the roof was gone, but my heartbeat was loud enough to fill the void. This can't be happening. The only light came from the faint glow of the snowy landscape rushing past the windows. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist outside, warping into eerie, unrecognizable forms. My breath fogged in front of me, and I realized the air inside the train had grown colder. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They started faint, like someone walking down the aisle at the far end of the car, but they grew louder with each passing second. Slow, deliberate, the sound of boots on the worn metal floor. I turned in my seat, peering into the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps paused. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined them, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the pitch-black train car. But then, they resumed closer this time. I fumbled for my phone, its faint screen light suddenly feeling like the only lifeline I had. I swiped at the flashlight app, and the beam cut through the darkness, casting sharp, shifting shadows across the empty seats. Empty. No one was there. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, impossibly close now. I swung the light toward the aisle, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. That's when I noticed the frost. It was creeping across the windows, not from the outside, but from within. The glass was crystallizing in intricate patterns, the cold seeping into the air around me. I shivered, clutching my coat tighter, and turned the flashlight toward the far end of the car. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape tall, dark, and barely visible in the faint light. It stood at the far end of the car, motionless, its head tilted slightly to one side as if watching me. I couldn't make out its features, but its presence filled the space with an unbearable heaviness. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move, it simply stood there, its shadow stretching across the floor toward me. A sudden jolt shook the train, throwing me forward in my seat. The lights flickered back on for a split second, and in that brief flash, I saw it clearly. It was a man, or at least, it had been. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His clothes were tattered and stained, and his hands hung limply at his sides. But the worst part was his expression, a hollow, joyless smile that didn't reach his eyes. When the lights went out again, the figure was gone. The train continued its relentless pace, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks the only sound now. My heart raced as I scanned the car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then, the footsteps started again, coming from behind me this time. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the air, but there was still nothing there. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from somewhere nearby, so faint I could barely make out the words. "You shouldn't be here." I shot to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me, and stumbled toward the door at the end of the car. My hands fumbled with the latch, and I shoved it open, stepping into the narrow passage between cars. The wind hit me like a slap, freezing and brutal, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever was in that car. I pushed into the next car and slammed the door behind me, breathing hard. This car was just as old and dilapidated as the first, but something about it felt wrong. The seats were empty, but they weren't like the ones in the previous car. These were covered in a layer of dust so thick, it looked like no one had sat there in decades. Cobwebs hung from the corners, swaying slightly with the motion of the train. And then I saw the luggage. Suitcases, trunks, and bags were piled haphazardly near the far end of the car. They were old, made of leather and wood, with faded tags that looked handwritten. I stepped closer, my curiosity battling my fear, and knelt beside one of the trunks. It was partially open, revealing clothes that were far too old to belong to anyone alive today. A moth-eaten coat, a pair of scuffed boots, and a small, yellowed envelope. I reached for the envelope, my fingers trembling. and pulled it out. Written on the front in faded ink was a name, Eleanor Marlowe. Before I could open it, the lights in the car flickered again, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, the envelope still clutched in my hand. There, standing at the far end of the car, was the figure. But this time, he wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside him, a woman, her face pale and expressionless, her hair hanging in damp, stringy strands around her shoulders. She wore a long, tattered dress that swayed as though caught in an invisible breeze. They didn't move, they didn't speak, they just stared at me, their lifeless eyes boring into mine. I backed away, my heart pounding, until my back hit the wall. The envelope slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor. The whispers began again, louder this time, overlapping and indistinct, filling the air with an unbearable pressure. And then, with a final flicker, the lights went out completely. I was plunged into complete darkness again, but I could still hear them, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer with each passing second. The air felt thick, as though something oppressive was closing in around me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my hands scrambled blindly for anything to hold on to in the dark. The walls of the train car were cold and unforgiving beneath my fingertips. "Stay calm, stay calm," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my racing thoughts. But the whispering voices were growing louder, their guttural tones weaving through the air like an unholy chant. I pressed my back to the cold, clammy wall, trying to steady myself, but every inch of my body was on high alert. I could feel the presence of the figures now, looming just beyond the edge of the darkness. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, briefly illuminating the car before plunging me back into blackness. But this time, the shadowy figures were no longer at the far end of the car. They were right in front of me. I sucked in a breath, stifling a scream, as the cold, hollow smile of the man appeared in the dim light. His face was inches from mine now, his hollow eyes staring through me. The woman stood beside him, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her lips were cracked, and her skin was drawn tight across her face, as though she hadn't eaten or slept in years. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but only a rasping breath escaped, followed by another whisper. "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the seat behind me, sending it crashing to the floor with a loud bang. The train car shook violently, as if the entire train was rocking on its tracks. The figures didn't move. They just watched me with those lifeless eyes, their presence suffocating, unrelenting. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The sound of my own voice felt so small against the crushing silence. I had to get out. I had to get off this train. I turned toward the door at the end of the car and lunged for it, yanking on the handle. To my shock, it was unlocked. I pushed it open and stumbled into the next car, my breath ragged and uneven. I slammed the door behind me, trying to calm my frantic heartbeat. The second car was darker than the first, the air colder. As I stumbled forward, I noticed something strange. The seats were arranged differently, almost as if they were facing one another. At the far end of the car, I saw a small round table surrounded by chairs. On the table was a lit candle, its flickering flame casting strange shadows on the walls. The train had no business being so warm here, so calm. But then, I noticed the passengers. There were people sitting in the seats, their faces obscured by shadows. At first, I thought they might be other commuters, somehow unaffected by the strange things happening on the train. But as I took a step closer, my eyes adjusted to the low light, and I saw that their faces were too still, too pale, like lifeless mannequins. I froze in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The people sitting in the seats weren't alive. One of the older man turned his head slowly, as though he had sensed my presence. His eyes were wide, glazed over, and as he opened his mouth to speak, I saw that his teeth were sharp and yellowed, like they didn't belong to a human being at all. "Come join us," he rasped. "The table is set. There's always room for one more." I could feel my skin crawl as his words echoed in my mind. The invitation wasn't warm, it was cold, like a curse wrapped in false hospitality. I backed away, nearly stumbling over my own feet. The candlelight flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of the people. They were closing in on me. The figures from the first car were here too, now standing at the entrance, their smiles wide and unnatural. "Join us," they whispered, their voices a chorus of eerie harmony. I turned, desperate to find an escape, and sprinted toward the door at the far end of the car. My legs burned, but the voices seemed to follow, growing louder with every step I took. Just as I reached the door, a cold hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed my wrist. I screamed, wrenching myself free, but the grip tightened. Another hand, slender and paler, reached out from behind me, brushing against my neck, and I felt my skin prickle with fear. "You can't leave," a voice whispered in my ear, breath icy and foul. "You're already one of us." I yanked open the door, and this time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped out into the freezing night. The snowstorm was still raging, the wind howling like a living thing. The train continued to move beneath me, its wheels screeching, but I wasn't on it anymore. I stood at the edge of the tracks, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I looked down at the train as it pulled away, and that's when I saw it. There was a face pressed against the window of the last car. A gaunt, hollow-eyed face with a twisted smile, watching me as the train disappeared into the snowstorm. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but the figure's eyes locked with mine. "You'll never leave," it whispered, its voice carrying over the wind. The train was gone. The night was silent, but the chill in my bones didn't fade. I turned and walked away from the tracks, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The train had vanished into the storm. The people had vanished. But I knew one thing for certain. I was never going to forget what I saw. The snowstorm outside had become even fiercer, the howling wind blurring everything into a white, suffocating fog. I kept walking, each step heavier than the last as the cold seeped into my bones. The feeling of eyes on me never left, a gnawing sensation in the back of my mind, like I was being watched from every direction. I don't know how long I walked. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning in that oppressive storm. My hands were numb, my face raw from the biting wind. I needed to get away, to put distance between myself and whatever nightmare that train had been. The thought of returning to the station crossed my mind, but something in my gut told me that the station was no longer a place of safety. In fact, it never had been. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated shack on the side of the road. Its wooden exterior was worn down by years of weather, and its roof sagged as if the structure had long ago given up on surviving the harsh winters. There was no sign of life around it, no lights in the windows, no smoke rising from the chimney. It looked abandoned, just like everything else around me. I knocked weakly on the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own, just like the train cars had. But nothing happened. I knocked again, more forcefully this time, and when I heard nothing in return, I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was warm, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The cabin was small, with a single dim light hanging from the ceiling. It was sparsely furnished, a few chairs, a small stove, a bed tucked into one corner. The most striking thing, however, was the old wooden table in the center of the room, cluttered with pieces of paper and a couple of small empty bottles. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. There was a strange, musty smell in the air, a mixture of old wood and something else that I couldn't place. I moved to the table, my feet dragging, and looked down at the papers. At first, it just seemed like old newspaper clippings, faded with age, detailing nothing more than mundane stories of local happenings. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The title of one clipping was "The Train to Nowhere," and it was dated almost a century ago. I scanned the article, trying to make sense of the words. It spoke of a mysterious train that was said to appear in the dead of night during the winter months. The train would pass through small, forgotten towns on the outskirts of nowhere, carrying with it a strange, unnatural presence. Locals had reported seeing it, but when they went to investigate, the train was always gone, leaving only a cold, eerie silence in its wake. The article went on to describe people who had disappeared after encountering the train. Some had vanished completely, while others had returned with blank expressions, unable to speak of what they had seen. It was as though the train, and whatever was aboard it, had stolen something from them, their minds, their souls. As I read, a chill settled in my chest. The train described in the article was the exact one I had encountered, and the people who had vanished were like the ones I had seen: the pale figures, the hollow eyes, the twisted smiles. My fingers trembled as I turned the next page, but what I read made my stomach drop. The article was written by someone named Eleanor Marloweith, same name that had been on the envelope I found earlier, the same woman I had seen in the train car. I felt lightheaded, as though the room was spinning around me. The air felt thick, suffocating, and for the first time since the events had begun, I wondered if maybe I had never truly left the train at all. I sat down in one of the chairs by the table, my mind racing. The woman Eleanor had written these articles, which meant she had known about the train long before I'd encountered it. Had she been trying to warn someone? Had she been trying to escape it too? Suddenly, the light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The storm outside raged even louder, the wind whipping around the small shack. And then, as if on cue, I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the far corner of the room where the bed was. I turned my head, but the darkness was too thick to make out anything. The creaking sound continued, slow and deliberate, like someone shifting in the bed. I swallowed hard. There was no one else in the room. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The creaking grew louder, followed by a faint rustling noise like someone moving beneath the bed covers. My breath hitched in my throat. I stood up, my hands shaking as I grabbed for anything to defend myself. A heavy iron kettle sat on the stove, and I clutched it in my hand, ready to swing it if necessary. The bed was now shifting, the covers moving as if something or someone was beneath them. "No," I whispered, backing away. The shadows in the corner deepened, and I could feel the temperature in the room plummet once again. My fingers numbed as the icy chill wrapped around me like a vice. The rustling noise stopped, and then came a soft, low chuckleon that sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. I tried to move, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. And then, through the darkness, a voice whispered, soft but unmistakable, "You shouldn't have come. You're one of us now." The bed suddenly shifted violently, and I screamed, throwing the kettle toward the bed and stumbling backward toward the door. The light flickered once more and then went out for good. In the pitch-black darkness, the last thing I heard was the unmistakable sound of someone crawling across the floor toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I slammed open the door and bolted outside into the storm, my feet slipping in the snow as I ran blindly, not knowing where I was going. But then, in the distance, I saw something that made my heart stop. A shadowy figure moving slowly across the snow-covered tracks. It was the same train that I thought I had escaped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All that mattered in that moment was the train looming in the distance like a specter from my nightmares. The snow whipped around me as I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. Its massive shape seemed to crawl through the storm, the sound of its wheels grinding against the tracks, a deep, rhythmic hum that reverberated in my chest. I hadn't escaped. I had never left. The realization hit me like a blow to the stomach. I was back at the station, or at least some twisted version of it. My feet seemed to move on their own as I found myself walking toward the tracks, compelled by an invisible force, something that pulled me closer to that inevitable end. I didn't want to move. I couldn't hide. Every step felt as though it was preordained, as though I was being drawn into something much larger than myself. As I neared the tracks, the train screeched to a halt, its dark form looming just inches away from me. The doors to the train car opened slowly, creaking on their rusted hinges. Inside, the pale figures I had seen earlier, those lifeless passengers, stood like statues, their blank faces staring at me as though they had been waiting for me all along. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. The whispering voices from the train filled my mind, each one calling to me, urging me to board, to step inside. Join us. I turned toward the open door, feeling a cold hand press against my back, as if urging me forward. But something inside me, some small, defiant spark, resisted. I fought against it, despite the overwhelming urge to step inside, to be a part of whatever twisted fate awaited me. But then, in the midst of my struggle, I saw her. Eleanor Marlowe. She was standing at the edge of the platform, her gaunt face illuminated by the train's dim light. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't dead. Not completely. She was caught in some kind of limbo, a prisoner of this train, this nightmare that had been dragging people into its web for decades. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear her words over the thundering rush of blood in my ears. I took a step toward her, and her face twisted into something almost like a smile. It was an agonized, hollow smile, one that promised nothing but more of the same endless, unrelenting torment of the train. "Eleanor," I called out, my voice breaking as I took another step. Her eyes widened, and her head tilted as if considering my presence. She reached out with a pale hand, and I saw that it was trembling. Don't get on," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You can't leave once you do." I felt a knot form in my stomach. There was something in her voice, something that told me she had made the same choice once. She had stepped onto that train, and now she was forever bound to it. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had ever stepped foot on this cursed train. Before I could say anything more, the train gave a violent lurch, and the doors slammed shut. I staggered backward, nearly losing my balance as I watched the figures inside move toward the windows, their faces pressing against the glass, their eyes pleading. "You belong here now," their voices echoed in unison. "Join us." I turned away, my heart pounding. I couldn't be one of them. I wouldn't let this train claim me. But the storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, pushing me back toward the tracks, pushing me toward the train. I stumbled as the ground beneath me gave way. My feet slid in the snow, and before I knew it, I was falling toward the tracks, toward the train. The last thing I remember was the deafening sound of the train's whistle, echoing like a warning, and the cold, icy hands reaching for me, pulling me closer. When I woke up, I was back on the train, but everything had changed. The car was no longer dark and abandoned. The seats were filled, crowded with people, but not living people. They were all like the figures I had seen before, pale, lifeless, their eyes fixed on me, unmoving, unblinking. Their faces were twisted in expressions of pure despair, their bodies rigid, frozen in place as though they were trapped in time. I was sitting in one of the seats, my body stiff, my hands cold, my breath shallow. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. And then I heard it, the soft scrape of boots against the floor. I turned my head slowly, and I saw him, the man who had smiled at me earlier, his hollow eyes locked with mine as he stepped closer, his smile widening unnaturally. "Welcome to the Christmas train," he said, his voice low and guttural. "We've been waiting for you." The train rumbled on, the endless tracks stretching out before us, disappearing into the dark horizon. The faces around Metho's lifeless passengers didn't move, they didn't speak, but their eyes followed me, never blinking, never turning away. I was a part of this now. I had stepped onto the train and I would never leave. The Christmas train was my home now, just like it had been for so many before me. It never stopped, it never let go, and every year it would find someone new to claim. And so, as the snowstorm raged outside and the whispering voices filled the car once more, I knew I had become part of the legend of the Christmas train. the ones who are never meant to leave. Hey everyone, I hope you're all ready for another eerie tale. This one comes from an email I received recently from a listener. At first, I thought it was just another ghost story, but when I started reading, I realized something was off, something much darker. I'll let you judge for yourselves. It was Christmas Eve. I had been working long hours in the city, and honestly, I was exhausted. My mind was set on getting back home to my small town to spend the holiday with my family. There's something about Christmas that brings a sense of peace, of nostalgia, but I wasn't feeling that this year. Maybe it was because the holiday rush was weighing down on me. But regardless, I packed up and rushed to catch my train. This wasn't any regular train ride. No, this was one of those old-fashioned, scenic trains, the kind you see in the movies. They run through the mountains, the countryside, and the tracks are often surrounded by dense forests. I had been on this route before, and though I'd heard rumors about strange occurrences, I never thought much of them. People say a lot of things, right? The train was nearly empty when I boarded, which I thought was odd for Christmas Eve. A few passengers sat scattered in the plush seats, their faces turned toward the windows, staring out at the falling snow. I took my seat near the back, wanting to relax before the long journey ahead. But from the moment I sat down, I felt wrong. It was like a weight on my chest, like I couldn't breathe fully, or that something was pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my tired mind playing tricks. I hadn't been getting much sleep lately, so maybe this feeling would pass once I closed my eyes. I was wrong. The train started to move, the whistle piercing the quiet as we slowly pulled out of the station. As the train chugged forward, I noticed something odd. The lights above flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and the air seemed to grow colder than it should have been inside. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation crawling up my spine. I glanced at the other passengers, hoping to find some sort of reassurance, but they all sat still, unmoving. I mean, really still. It was as if they were frozen in time, staring blankly ahead, their eyes wide but unblinking. At first, I thought maybe they were just tired like me, but then I noticed that none of them seemed to be breathing. No rise and fall of their chests, not a single sign of life. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stood up, hoping to stretch my legs and shake off the creeping sense of dread that was slowly suffocating me. But the moment I stood, the train shifted. It felt like it lurched forward, but not in the usual way. This felt deliberate, like something was steering the train off course. My heart began to race. I walked toward the front of the train, passing the lifeless passengers as I went. I wanted to get to the conductor. Surely he could explain the odd atmosphere on board. But as I made my way to the front, I started to hear something, a soft whisper, like the sound of wind rustling through dry leaves. I turned around, but there was no one behind me. No one had moved. The whispering grew louder, and as I approached the conductor's cabin, it became impossible to ignore. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and the door creaked open by itself. Inside, the conductor was there, just standing by the window, staring out into the night, his hands pressed against the glass. His uniform was old-fashioned, almost from another time, and his face was as pale as the snowstorm outside. He didn't move when I entered. He didn't even acknowledge me. I asked him if everything was okay, but he didn't respond. His lips barely moved when he spoke. "We don't stop." The words sent a chill through me. Before I could respond, the train suddenly jolted again, and I stumbled forward, catching myself against the doorframe. The lights above flickered again, and then went out completely. The train fell into darkness. The only thing I could hear was the sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks and my own breath, shallow and panicked. I tried to find my way back to my seat, but it was nearly impossible to see in the pitch black. The sound of the train's movement became disorienting, like we were spiraling into an abyss. And then it happened. I heard something, or rather, someone, a soft whisper, a voice. "Come find us." The voice was faint, almost like a child calling out from a distant room. It wasn't a sound that should have come from the empty train, not with all the passengers so still. The whispering grew louder, circling around me, moving closer, until it felt as if it were right next to my ear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then the lights flickered back on. What I saw made my stomach drop. The train had transformed. The seats were no longer plush and comfortable. They were cracked, weathered, and aged. The curtains hanging by the windows were torn, fluttering in a non-existent breeze. The air had turned thick and musty, the stench of mildew and decay filling my nostrils. But what was worse was the passengers. They were no longer the same. Their eyes, wide open and unblinking, now glowed faintly in the dim light. Their faces were twisted into grotesque, empty expressions, grins too wide, eyes too hollow. They were all staring at me, like they had been waiting for me all along. And then, one by one, they began to move. Their heads jerked in my direction, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they turned to face me. I froze, my body unable to respond. Their eyes, those horrible, soulless eyes, followed every movement I made. Suddenly, the train lurched again, and the figure nearest to me leaned forward, its face inches from mine. Its skin was gray, its features stretched thin, and its mouth was stretched into a grin that went far beyond what was humanly possible. It whispered again, "You shouldn't have come." I don't know how I made it back to the door, but when I reached it, I didn't hesitate. I ripped the door open, the cold air immediately flooding in, stinging my face as I stumbled out onto the snow-covered tracks. But as I ran, I looked back, and I saw it. The train was still there, sitting motionless, as though it had never moved at all. And that's when I realized it wasn't about getting off the train. It was never about leaving. I don't know how long I ran. The snowstorm had swallowed the world around me, turning the night into an endless blur of white. Each step felt like a struggle against something far bigger than me, as if the storm itself were trying to push me back toward the train, toward whatever nightmare awaited there. I stumbled over the icy ground, gasping for breath, my legs burning from exhaustion. But when I finally stopped to look around, I realized something that nearly made my heart stop entirely. There were no tracks. The train had vanished. I had been running along what should have been the path of the tracks, but now it was just an endless expanse of snow. No train, no platform, nothing. Just an empty, frozen wasteland stretching out in front of me. I turned around, expecting to see the train, but it was gone, completely gone, as though it had never existed at all. The air was eerily still, the wind howling through the trees like a distant, mournful wail. And then I heard it, a faint whistle, almost imperceptible over the wind. But it wasn't coming from behind me, where the train had been. It was coming from somewhere ahead. I had to know. I had to see what was happening. I don't know why I kept pushing myself forward. Maybe it was some kind of twisted curiosity, or maybe it was fear that the train, or whatever it was, would follow me. But in my gut, I felt something dark, telling me to keep moving. I walked for what felt like hours, the landscape never changing, the snow never letting up. And with every step I took, that whistle grew louder, clearer, until I felt as though it was just a breath away. It was maddening, that sound like something alive calling me, beckoning me, pulling me toward the inevitable. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I saw it again. The train. But this wasn't the same train as before. No, this was something darker, something twisted. The train stood still in the middle of the clearing, its body battered and old, rusted in places as though it had been abandoned for years. But there was no mistaking it, the same faint glow of the windows, the same eerie silence that seemed to suffocate the world around it. And inside were faces, dozens of them, and they were all looking at me. I froze in place, my body locked in terror as I stared into the glowing windows. The faces inside were pale, gaunt, and lifeless. But their eyes, they were different this time. They were awake. They were alive. There was a figure near the front of the train, a woman in a tattered, old-fashioned dress. Her hair was long and wild, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty. Her hands gripped the bars of the window, her fingers twitching as if trying to reach out to me. "Join us," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind, a voice that wasn't her own. I could feel the pull in my chest again, the same force that had drawn me toward the train before. It was stronger this time, almost like a magnet, something I couldn't fight, something I didn't want to fight. The other passengers began to move. They shifted in their seats, their bodies jerking unnaturally, their heads twitching toward me, their eyes following my every move. Their mouths opened, but they didn't speak, they howled, a guttural, inhuman noise that filled the air and made my skin crawl. "You belong with us now," the woman's voice echoed again, softer this time, as if it were coming from inside my own mind. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, stuck in place, unable to break free from the magnetic pull of that train, from the voices calling me. Without warning, the doors to the train slid open with a deafening screech. I saw the figure of the woman step out, her feet barely touching the ground as she floated toward me, her gaze never leaving my face. "You're here. You've finally arrived," she said, her voice low, sweet, and terrifying all at once. I tried to take a step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. All I could do was stare into those hollow eyes, those eyes that promised endless suffering, endless nights trapped in this nightmare. But then, just as she was almost upon me, I heard a loud crash from inside the train, followed by a series of unnatural, bone-crushing sounds. I wanted to turn away, to escape, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the figure that was now standing just inches from me. She raised a bony hand and reached out for my face, her fingers curling into claws. I braced myself for the worst, knowing deep down that there was no escaping this, no way out. And then, just as her hand was about to touch my skin, I heard a voice of someone shouting. It was a man's voice, distant at first, but growing clearer. He was shouting my name, my full name. "Get away from it! Run!" the voice screamed. I snapped out of my trance, my body suddenly flooding with adrenaline. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of the train's whistle still echoing behind me, but louder now, almost deafening. The snow beneath my feet was slippery, the cold air sharp against my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to escape. I don't know how far I ran. It felt like hours, but when I finally stopped, panting and exhausted, I looked around and realized I wasn't outside anymore. The landscape had shifted. The snow was gone, replaced by cold, dark stone walls that rose up around me. I was standing in what looked like a train station, a station like no other. The air was thick with dust, and the floor beneath my feet was slick with something I didn't want to identify. And then I saw them again. The passengers from the train. They were here, standing in the shadows, their faces still staring, their bodies unmoving. They were waiting for me. And then I understood. I wasn't running away from the train. I was running toward it. The station around me felt wrong. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and the stone walls loomed high above like a tomb. The air was thick with a musty, metallic smell, as if this place hadn't been touched in decades or longer. I could hear my own breath echo in the stillness, the only sound in a place that shouldn't exist. The passengers, the ones from the train, were still standing there, watching me. I could feel their eyes, unblinking and cold, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for me to join them, to accept the darkness that had already claimed them. Their faces, pale and drawn, seemed to flicker in and out of focus, like something trapped between this world and the next. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were stuck in the thick, frozen air. It was as if the place had a hold on me, an invisible grip that kept me tethered to this cursed station. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a low, gravelly whisper, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I turned, expecting to see the woman from the train, but there was no one there. And then I saw it. The train again, sitting in the middle of the station, just like before. But now, it wasn't just a train, it was the train. the one that had been haunting me, the one that I couldn't escape. It was still, motionless, but I could feel its presence, like a dark shadow hanging over everything. The whistle, that damnable whistle, echoed through the station again, but this time, it sounded different. It was deeper, more ominous, as if it was coming from the very depths of hell itself. I couldn't move. My legs were heavy, like they were made of stone, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, as if it were trying to break free. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with every beat. "Join us," the voice whispered again, closer this time. It was the woman. She was there, just beyond the train, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Her face was twisted into that same grotesque grin, her mouth stretching impossibly wide as she beckoned me toward the train. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth felt dry, my throat tight. I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. The passengers began to shift again, their eyes following me, their bodies slowly swaying like they were alive with some malevolent force. All of them, every single one of them, was moving toward me, their limbs jerking in unnatural ways, their hands reaching out, their mouths gaping open in silent hunger. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me. They wanted me to join them, to be like them. They wanted me to be trapped, forever wandering this cursed station, with no escape. "You're here forever now," the woman said, her voice filled with malice, a promise of endless torment. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, and the air around me felt like it was closing in, suffocating me. I thought I might collapse right there, right in front of the train. But then I don't know what happened, but something snapped in my head. I broke free. I ran. I don't know how, but I ran. My legs moved on their own, my feet pounding against the cold stone floor, faster than I'd ever run before. The passengers' voices rose in a chorus of whispers, their hands reaching toward me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the end of the platform, where there was a door, a metal door that led out of this nightmare. I didn't hesitate. I pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled again, harder this time, and to my surprise, it opened with a creak, revealing a set of dark stairs leading down into even deeper shadows. The whispers followed me as I descended, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was too afraid that if I did, I would be lost forever. I kept running down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning from the exertion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. But instead of a door, there was another train. The same train. The same haunting whistle filled the air, and I knew without a doubt that I had reached the heart of it, the core of whatever this nightmare was. The train was standing still, but this time it was different. The passengers weren't seated anymore. They were all standing, crowded at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes glowing in the dark. The train wasn't just a train. It was a living thing, alive with malice, alive with hunger. "You belong to us now," the voice whispered again, clearer than ever. I don't remember how I got out. I don't remember running or how I managed to escape. All I know is that when I woke up, I was back on the platform, in the middle of the station. The snow was falling gently around me, just as it had been before. The train was gone. The station was empty. But the feeling stayed with me. And that's when I realized something. I wasn't free. It's been days since that night, and I've tried everything to put this behind me. But no matter how far I go, no matter how hard I try to forget, I can still hear it. That whistle, that damned whistle. And I can feel them, watching. The passengers, waiting. I don't know what they want from me, but I fear that one day I'll have to board that train again. It's been weeks since that night, and I'm not the same. I've tried to move on, to pretend like everything's okay, but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong, something is following me. Every time I close my eyes, I see those pale faces pressed against the windows of the train, their hollow eyes staring into my soul. The worst part? It's getting worse. At first, it was just the occasional glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, a whisper in the dead of night that would make my blood run cold. But now, it's different. Every night, when I lie down to sleep, I hear the whistle. Faint at first, but growing louder, closer, as if it's right outside my window. And sometimes, I'll wake up in the middle of the night to find the air colder than usual. So cold that I can see my breath, even inside my own room. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the stress of the experience taking its toll. But then, last night, something happened that I can't explain. I had been out for a walk, trying to clear my head. The snow had begun to fall again, light flakes drifting lazily from the sky. As I walked down the path near the train station, the very same station, I felt the strange sensation again. That feeling of being watched, followed. I turned down a side street to avoid the station, not wanting to tempt fate, but as I walked, I heard something that made my heart drop into my stomach. A train whistle. It wasn't distant this time. It wasn't a fading sound lost in the wind. No, it was close. Incredibly close. I froze in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be. The train had disappeared weeks ago. It had vanished the moment I had escaped from that nightmare, or so I thought. But now I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the sound of the train grew louder, more distinct. And then I saw it. Through the mist of the falling snow, there it was, the train coming toward me. I thought my heart would stop. It wasn't like any train I had seen before. The lights were dim, flickering as if they were struggling to stay on, and the train moved slowly, almost as if it were gliding through the snow rather than running on tracks. The air felt thick, the atmosphere suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. It was too quiet, too eerie, and worst of all, the faces. I saw them again. They were pressed against the windows, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. The train screeched to a halt just a few feet away. The door slid open with a low, mechanical hiss. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted, but something kept me rooted to the spot. That voice, the woman's voice, was inside my head again, whispering softly, "Join us. You can never escape. You've always belonged here." I could feel it, the pull, stronger than ever before. My body was no longer my own. I couldn't fight it. I wanted to fight it, but every part of me was drawn to the train, to those faces staring at me. Before I could move, a hand gripped my shoulder, a cold, clammy hand, as though the very touch of it had drained all the warmth from my body. I whirled around, expecting to see the woman, the pale, twisted figure from before, but instead, I saw someone else. A man, a stranger. He was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned military coat, the kind that looked like it belonged in another time. His face was weathered, his eyes dark, with a look of quiet desperation. But when he spoke, it was clear that he knew exactly what was going on. "You need to leave." His voice was rough, strained, as if he had been screaming for years and had finally lost the strength to raise his voice. Before I could say anything, he grabbed my arm and yanked me away from the train, pulling me back down the path, away from the station. I tried to pull free, but his grip was firm, relentless. And then, just as we reached a safer distance, he turned to face me, his eyes wide with fear. "The train," he gasped, breathless. "It's real. It never stops. It takes people like you, and it traps them forever. You can't get away, no matter how far you run." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "The train," he repeated, his eyes pleading. "It doesn't just run on tracks. It runs on souls. It finds people like you, people who've seen it, who've felt it. It lures you back, over and over again. You'll never be free. It will always come for you." I didn't know whether to believe him, but as I stood there, feeling the icy wind bite at my skin, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The train, that train, wasn't gone. It was never gone. It had just been waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for me to step back into its grip. I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see the train still there, waiting in the darkness, but the path was empty. The station was gone. I didn't feel any safer, though. I could still hear it, the whistle. Louder this time, almost deafening. I could feel the pull, as if it were calling to me, as if it was beckoning me to return to it, to give in. The stranger's grip tightened on my arm. "You need to leave," he repeated, his voice breaking. "You can't stay here. It'll come for you. It's already noticed you." I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing: I couldn't go back to that station. I couldn't get on that train. Not again. I don't know what happened to the stranger after that. I didn't stay long enough to ask. My body was already moving, my mind racing with the realization that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would never be free of the train. It would find me. It would always find me. I ran, faster than I had ever run before, my heart pounding in my chest. The snow began to fall harder, and I could barely see through the blizzard, but I didn't care. I just had to keep going, had to get as far away as possible. And then, in the distance, I saw it again. The lights of the train, flickering through the snow. It was right behind me, following me, as if it had never left. It was impossible to deny now. The train had never stopped following me. No matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I moved, I could feel it right behind me, just on the edge of my awareness, as if it were always a step away from catching up. The whistle, that haunting, dreadful whistle, echoed through the blizzard, cutting through the wind like a knife. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things. But the coldness in the air, far colder than it should have been for December, wasn't something I could dismiss. It felt wrong. The snowflakes didn't fall like they should. They drifted sideways, as if caught in some otherworldly current, swirling around me in impossible patterns. The train was close now. I could hear its engine, a low, grinding sound, like metal on metal, a beast that had been awake for far too long. My heart raced, and a wave of terror washed over me. It wasn't just that the train was reality, was that it had always been real. It had always been here, in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to claim me. I stumbled, the snow beneath my feet, too deep, too thick. The air was suffocating, as if it were made of something heavier than oxygen. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my legs weakening with every step I took. I had to keep moving. I had to. But I couldn't escape. A flash of light pierced the storm, and I turned to see it. The train. The same train, but now it was coming toward me, its headlights blinding. It was moving fast, far too fast for a train in a snowstorm. It shouldn't have been able to move like that. The snow should have stopped it. The storm should have slowed it down. But no, it just kept coming, relentless, unyielding. And then, I saw them again. The passengers, all of them. They were standing at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes wide and hollow, staring at me with that same unblinking gaze. The woman, the one who had whispered to me in the station, in the dark, was among them, her grin stretching unnaturally wide, her eyes glowing with an unsettling, unnatural light. They were waiting for me. The train screeched to a halt right in front of me, and the door slid open once more, inviting me in. I could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, echoing in my head. "Come in, join us." I knew I couldn't go back there. I couldn't go through that nightmare again. But the pull was stronger now, more intense. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to turn away, but I couldn't move. The cold had seeped deep into my bones. My body refused to listen to me. "You're one of us now," the voice from inside the train said, this time louder, more insistent. "You can't escape." I had to fight it. I had to. But no matter how hard I tried, my feet moved on their own, slowly stepping toward the train. The whispers wrapped around my mind like a vice, suffocating me, drowning me in their cold, oppressive grip. It wasn't just the woman anymore. It was all of them, the passengers reaching out, their faces pressed against the glass like dead things, calling to me. I couldn't escape. I could feel it in my bones now. The train had been following me for a reason, and that reason was me. I stepped onto the train. The door closed behind me with a hiss, and I stood in the dark, empty corridor. The train lurched forward, slowly at first, and then faster, as if it was feeding off the fear in my chest. The passengers were still there, still staring, their eyes following me as I stumbled down the aisle. I could hear them whispering again. Their voices were low, like a chorus of wind through dry leaves, their words indistinguishable, but somehow familiar. They were calling to me, urging me to join them, to sit with them, to become one of them. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the train, there was a door, another door, the last door, the one that would lead me to the final destination. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I stepped toward it, drawn to it, unable to stop. My fingers touched the cold metal of the door, and I could feel the heat from beyond it, something warm, something alive. I opened it slowly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't another car of the train. It was the station. The same station, the same place. The walls were the same damp, cold stone, the same flickering lights, the same unnatural silence. And standing there, waiting for me, was the woman. She smiled. Her eyes gleamed with that same malevolent joy. I tried to turn back, but the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. The train had brought me back to where it had all begun. "You're one of us now," she said, her voice filled with sweet poison. "You'll never leave. You'll never be free." I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, but I couldn't. My body was numb, my limbs frozen with terror. And then, as I stood there, paralyzed, I understood the truth. The train didn't just take people. It took their souls. It trapped them forever in that endless loop. And I was just another lost soul, another passenger on the train that would never stop. The door to the station creaked open, and I saw them, the other passengers. They were standing there, waiting, their faces lit by the flickering light. They were all looking at me. I couldn't escape, not now. And that was when I realized I was never meant to leave the train. I was never meant to escape. The whistle sounded one last time, and then everything went dark.